The other day, my fiance stopped me mid-rant to ask me, why have you read almost all of Stephen King's books if you don't really like him that much as an author? And I think that's a really good question. So I decided to make a list of I think, 26 Stephen King books that I've read and rank them and try to figure out what I like and dislike about his work and why I've read so much of it beyond just having been a teenage boy who was into horror and you just read a lot of Stephen King. And it's only 26 if you count each of the Dark Tower novels individually. Yes, I have read all the Dark Tower, but I think it'll be a really interesting way to sort of get into the appeal of Stephen King for so many people and why so many books have been read by so many people, including both fortunately and unfortunately me. So let's start with the very worst Stephen King book that I've ever read, which is a relatively recent one, Mr. Mercedes. I find one of the great strengths of Stephen King's work is his character development. He will create a character that feels very real and lived, and even side characters will have very interesting stories, which you'll see on later in this list. But when he does not do it well, his books will just immediately fall apart. And I think Mr. Mercedes absolutely just does not work. What I remember from this book is that the main villain, Mr. Mercedes, just really doesn't feel interesting at all. He's a guy with a Mercedes that runs people over. It just didn't really work. And then the very worst part, which I think is a really big weakness of Stephen King, is that he has a side character who's black and young, and Stephen King cannot write that. And it just feels probably like the most racist thing that your main uncle would write if he was asked to write a black character, and it just does not work on any level. It takes you immediately out of it. It is very problematic, and the story itself is not interesting. This is one of the worst books I've read, and it's just not on par for Stephen King, and I really recommend everyone avoid it. Apparently it was a bestseller, but dear God, this is just a terrible book, and I think the character work really lets it down on top of the story just not being particularly well thought out. The other really bad Stephen King book that I've read is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which honestly I feel should be a short story. Why it is a novel makes no sense. A girl gets lost. There's a lot of really good sort of baseball metaphors, but it is a full novel and it is just boring. There's not enough story there. The character sort of works, but you just feel him trying to fill out this thing that goes to the perspective of the parents and just does not work. And I think, as you'll see, when Stephen King is a lot more contained, he can be very good. And when he has a really sprawling story, he can be good. But when he's just sort of writing and plumping something out, it can be just really writing for the sake of writing. And that graphomania, which is means that he's written so many books, really lets it down here, because this could have been a really solid, very American short story about baseball and growing up, and it just does not work as a longer piece of work. We then get into, again, one of the newer Stephen King's, which was The Outsider, which is sort of more of a detective novel. Again, him doing genre work, not necessarily horror. It's very by the numbers. It just feels like he's got a character that he likes to run with. Nothing in here is surprising. It works pretty well, but it's not really all that good and would be just a very mediocre book by anything else. And just, it has not stuck with me in any way, so I can barely remember much of the plot. But yeah, The Outsider, just very mediocre Stephen King. I think this is why I've read so many of his books, because he just writes so much. He has so many books. I've read 26 novels, and I don't think I've even read half or maybe even a third of all that he's written. So you just end up reading Stephen King because he has so much stuff out there, and some of it really isn't good, including this Outsider book. That being said, he's got some better books out here. I think one of the newer ones that I liked was Doomickey, which just sort of had an interesting concept where there's an artist character that he sort of runs with. I remember it being sort of very visually interesting and droning on a bit, but I remember really liking it for what it was and getting to know what you're used to. And I think that's another thing that I like about Stephen King is you sort of know what you're getting into. You know you're getting character based thing. He has a story and he's running with it, and he doesn't know how it's going to end. You don't know how it's going to end. I think that's part of the fun of reading a longer Stephen King story, because he's just writing. He will write every single day, and he doesn't know where he's going with it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But you have this feeling of discovering the plot together with Stephen King, which I think is nice. And I think Doomickey is a really relatively solid, newer Stephen King. I don't know if this next book's position on the list will be a bit controversial, but it's The Shining, which I think is actually a really good tale of alcoholic father trying to mend his ways and just the psychosis of being alone and the pressures of parenthood and writing. And I think it's an interesting book, but just I think the movie just dominates so heavy in the imagination that all the changes that Kubrick made were for the better and more interesting. Like I still can't get the cricket bat out of my head from the book, and it takes a lot more of a longer unspooling. And I think yeah, it's a solid novel, but I think just in the zeitgeist and even in my head while I was reading it, I couldn't get the movie out of it, and it just didn't hit me. Though I think it's a relatively good Stephen King. This next book could honestly be a lot lower on list. I mean, like one of the worst ones, but it's just so 80s and like coke fueled Stephen King that I sort of enjoyed it despite all of its horribleness. This was when he was writing under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, seeing if you get the same appeal. And this is The Running Man, which is like a game show, post apocalyptic, just very 80s. You can see it as an action movie. Um, yeah, it has a lot of problematic depictions of racism, a bit of weird race stuff that you get into with some of the main Stephen King stuff, but I just thought it's a very trashy thriller. So if you're into that, you should be into that. And I think again, you get a variety with Stephen King. Sometimes you'll get like a really psychological meditative novel like The Shining. Sometimes you'll get just a silly action set piece like Running Man, and it's got some good set pieces. It's crazy, it's weird, and yeah, honestly, probably a really badly executed book. But I just think the themes are just so 80s that if you think it's of its time, I enjoyed it despite myself. Then we get into the decent Stephen King, Gerald's Game. I'm again, the movie sort of has taken its place in my whole. I haven't reread any of these books for the list because honestly, that's like a year's worth of work, and I don't want to reread a lot of Stephen King considering my complicated relationship with it. But Gerald's Game, again, I remember just the imagery in this being very good. It's very character based. It's a woman imprisoned on a bed as she's trying to sort through her life. There's a monster, her husband who's died. It's just good. It's really memorable and it's relatively short, so Stephen King isn't able to get into his weird things. But as you'll see, some of his longer stuff I actually enjoy even more if he can figure it out. Now we get into a novel that I actually read relatively recently for a horror book club, which is Cujo. And yeah, I think this is actually a pretty solid book. And it is, again, the character work is great because you get perspective from Cujo as just like a dumb dog going mad with rabies. The boy and just like the devastation of the final scene, I think, is just really, really good. Some of the character work is a bit dodgy, but I think overall, as a book, this really holds out as a very realistic Stephen King as far as it goes. Again, one of the more modern Stephen Kings was Revival, which I actually found I enjoyed really much. And I think he has so much deep background in horror that when he riffs with a setting, which in this case is sort of like a Frankenstein's thing, it can honestly be really fun. And he just rolls with it, lightning electricity. It feels like an elevated B movie, and you can just have fun with Stephen King if he's not getting too deep. And I think this is probably the most successful of, I guess, like the 21st century King books. He's written so many, and so many are not particularly good. But yeah, I enjoyed it. A bit above this for me, and I don't know if this is again controversial because a lot of people really like this, but Salem's Lot, one of his first vampire books, I think works. It's a really solid sort of, again, throwback to older vampire narratives. They're a bit creepier and more horrifying, but the character work I don't think is necessarily as good. Again, he can live and die by that, but it's a relatively solid B novel, and I know it's beloved by some people, but I don't remember it just hitting me particularly well. I know this one can be a bit controversial, but his really long book, The Stand, which again, post-apocalyptic, a lot of character work. I think some of the characters, I remember there's the creepy dude who's just horrifying, is really good. The depiction of like society sort of trying to come together is good. I think just the ending sort of falls apart. He doesn't know where he's writing to, so it's very immersive. The world building is very good. You get a very good Stephen King, but I think it's just overly long and sort of just untangles and falls apart. So this is more at the middle of my list. Then we move up a bit in the Bachman books with The Long Walk, which I think is literally better than Running Man in every way, and also very similar to the same premise. I think it's like a marathon in a post-apocalyptic society, but this one is just really good character work. I think it's a bit shorter, and I remember just this, the horrifyingness and the just sense of loss and devastation is really good in this. It's very bleak, and I think it's King really sort of firing on more cylinders, and this book will absolutely stick with you, though it does feel, again, very much like a genre work. I think this was a really one of the better Kings. I actually forgot in this list. Another 21st century king. Under the dome, people in the town are trapped under an impenetrable dome. Again, character work is really good here. I think it helps the antagonists really work. I think this is an evil sheriff of some kind, and just people trying to get through this really inexplicable event and the issues and efforts of it. And King is also figuring it out with you, and I think it becomes more complex and more interesting as he sort of figures out what he's saying. And unlike The Stand, I think in this he actually balances the ending well. That's the other thing with King. Sometimes you got a good ending, sometimes you got a bad ending. You figure it out with him, and this one I think was one of the better ones. Oh, and another really long 21st century king, 112263. Again, I think overly long, but this was just King playing with time travel, which I found really interesting. I think a guy's going back to try to stop the Kennedy assassination. So King steeped in Americana, I think, is always really, really interesting. And this is very, very American Stephen King. I remember the ending sort of being very interesting as he, like, I guess, messes up the time system and things are falling apart, if that's spoilers for any of you. But yeah, this was a relatively solid character work. But I think, again, what I like about Stephen King is you are getting a very American author who's going for it. So that, on top of any things, is I think another reason why I've enjoyed the work. But this is too long of a book, I think, for one thing. Again, it could be shorter. Again, one of the issues with Stephen King, he'll bring you along for the ride, and sometimes it is a very, very long ride. But let's keep moving along into Pet Sematary, another certified classic. And again, I think this is another thing with Stephen King. Like, so many of his books have been adapted into movies that they sort of become infused into the culture. And again, I remember the movie so much more. I think there's a sequel movie too. I remember that so much more than the book. But again, the concept's really interesting. Pets are coming back from the dead. People are potentially coming back. They're changed. They're demonic. Again, his ideas will really stick with you. Some of the imagery will stay with you. And this one just has that really main thing where everyone's saying, "Aya," in that very main accent. So again, Americana, it has that indigenous cemetery thing. So again, that sort of playing with the American mythos is really good. And I think that's why the next one is also up here on my list. And again, why I like Stephen King, which is the Dark Tower series. I know this is controversial. A lot of people were really disappointed by this, but I think the first book is absolutely incredible. The Gunslinger, just building a mythos and just going with it. The opening line is incredible, and it just really builds something very interesting. And then, of course, over the next books, Stephen King just sort of loses himself and goes crazy. Sometimes it really just does not go anywhere and you're just waiting for things to build, but he introduces some really good characters. And for this, I actually really like the ending. I think it fits perfectly with what's going, and it really wrapped up those stories for me. So I remember the beginning, I remember the end, I remember being very frustrated with some of the interior novels, but I think as a literary accomplishment, Stephen King doing a horror Western that's commenting on the creation of art and story and literature, like, you cannot get more self-referential than this. And I think it's just a really interesting thing to run through, even though it's, again, very long, but it has the Stephen Kings that you want. A lot of time for him to really spend with characters, and also him really plugging into America and weirdness and really running through it. Even if he does make, I think there's Harry Potter references in the end, it gets very weird, but I just love the ending. I love the beginning, and I will ignore everything in between because Stephen King rarely gets both of those right. My top 4, I think, Stephen King, which are books that I really, really love. And I think controversially, number 4 on my list is Needful Things. And I think for this one, it is just, again, the characters, the desperation in this small town. I remember a scene of a woman being with a portrait of Elvis being very ingrained into my teenage brain. But this book, I think, again, shows the strengths of King, just coming up with a concept of buy something that you will regret, cursed item, everything comes with that. But again, it wouldn't work if he wasn't so good at creating these people and filling them with desires, and everything falls apart. I think it's a really solid book, and I think they made a TV movie. I remember, again, a movie being made, and again, I think that speaks to the strength of his stories and the imagery that he creates, that anyone can sort of take his things and run with it and hopefully excise some of it down. But I've really fond memories of this book, though it was like 20 years ago that I read it. But hey, that's with Stephen King. He's going to stick with you. And a bit contradictory in my top 3, I have his novella collection, 4 Past Midnight, here. And again, I think it's Stephen King being more contained in his storytelling. He can really get an interesting story through. I just really love The Langoliers. I remember reading it an afternoon when I was a teenager on like a Sunday, and I came in and like the sun was shining, and it just felt this relief of being passive and being through the language. And again, the imagery is really strong. I think Secret Window is in there, Secret Garden. Something about, there's a crappy movie with Johnny Depp, one of the few times where I think the book was slightly better. But yeah, again, the novellas really stick with you. And I think Stephen King, much more honed and precise, is a much better writer. But that is immediately contradicted by my number two, which is It, which I really, really liked. I think the second, they recently did some movies of it. The second one is really, really bad, but this one is just so good. He has these characters, the flashbacks, the mix of timelines is really good. There's a serial killer character that gets killed, a burgeoning one, that still sticks with my brain. And controversially, I think the ending, as messed up it is as it is actually a decent metaphor for growing up in childhood, despite how crazy it is and messed up. But I really like the spider turtle battle, and I think just this existential cosmic thing he does really well. But a lot of the scenes in this are just incredible feats of imagination. Foreboding, the clown, Pennywise is incredible. And yeah, this is just Stephen King doing really messed up childhood stuff. It's really long, it's sprawling, but again, character work is there, imagery is there, ending for me is there, controversially. So yeah, this was just firing on all cylinders. Still really enjoy this really messed up Stephen King Americana book. And finally, my number one Stephen King is short story collection, Skeleton Crew. I mean, what can you say? Very focused Stephen King. He knows the endings he's going for. I remember, I think there was, again, a movie adaptation of The Monkey, but that thing was actually scary. A monkey banging cymbals. He actually makes it into an unsettling story with the imagery, with the character work. Very focused. Again, a lot of variety, which you really want to get through King. So I think my top list really shows that you get a whole bunch from novellas to really long novels to short stories, tackling a whole bunch of different subjects. So I think the more horrific and surreal, the better with King, though he can be really good. I haven't been as attracted to his more realist novels, but I think overall the reason I've read so much King is he was there, he can be interesting, and after reading like 4 or 5, you know what you're getting. You know we're getting an interesting, characterful story with lots of imagery that can be adapted into a movie. You're familiar with it and you keep reading. Though I haven't read a lot of Stephen King, particularly recently, outside of Horror Book Club. Let me know what you think of this list, which is completely based off vibes and hazy memories of like 20 years of reading Stephen King over the years. Is there anything that you think I should read? I actually have never read Carrie, which I think is his first published book, which is apparently very good. Movie's very good. But yeah, I think that's what's missing. Is there something that I really need to read? Is there something that you fundamentally disagree with? And yeah, we'll sort of see if I do some of these author profiles more. But all of this because my fiance was like, you don't even really like him. And I think when he's bad, he's really bad. When he's mediocre, he's actually pretty enjoyable. And when he's good, he's still not the best at all, but he writes good genre work that I find entertaining. And most of all, I think I'm familiar with him. Stephen King, for a horror fan, is like dipping into a warm bath. You know what you're going to get. It's going to be somewhat enjoyable if he knows what he's doing. And if not, you can just toss it away because there's probably quite a few books here that I started and did not finish from Stephen King. So that is my list, and I will see you next time.